our program. So, welcome to our podcast, where we wander and wonder and seek to walk in balance on the earth. I'm Darlene Rollins. I have a little retreat called Earth Walkways in Northern Virginia area. Um, and it's a beautiful nature retreat, and nature is our guide and our teacher. So, along with the wisdom traditions of humanity, I like to explore in this podcast, like how we can maybe learn and grow, see different perspectives, understand ourselves, and our world a little more fully, and from, I think, a basically more archaic or, interconnected connection with all of nature. And today I want to continue our exploration on the medicine wheel of the direction of the south, which is the time of the summer, which is where we are in our current, North American or Northern Hemisphere expression. And so we spoke of before how this expansion that happens as the heat of the sun increases is what defines this direction and the energies of this direction. And this expansion, provides and allows movement and adventure and exploration and new connections. It is the synergy of connection that allows the creativity of life to flourish. But with this expansion comes contact. And that contact can draw us into intimacy and connection, union, oneness, family, sexuality, or it can draw us into conflict and separation. And it requires trust and love to not turn into war in the South, right? And so those are also qualities of the direction of the South that we honor. And then there's this way which, how do we make love or war? Like we have to ask this question. So our session today is a profound study to honestly seek wisdom from nature about these states called peace and war. And we're going to explore how nature works with these energies and balances them. So maybe there is something we can apply to our own human experience. And it's true, nature has a powerful tooth and nail side of survival. And humans often suppose that it's just how life is. And we embrace competition, winning versus losing, as the natural way of things. And this justifies our ambitions and our devaluation of others. Kill or be killed, enslave or be enslaved. These seem to be the only choices that we have. And from that perspective, that's accurate. But we need to, shift our perspective a little more. And so if we look closer, we look at nature, does nature really feel or look like a war zone? If nature is only predator-prey dynamics, then where does everything else come from? Nature is actually an amazing diversity of places and perspective, niches, and symbiotic, serendipitous interconnections. While skirmishes take place, nature doesn't seem to create war in the same way humans do. Its foundation, nature's foundation, is really cooperation, synergy, and fundamental interdependence. Nature in conflict seeks boundary, seeks to live and let live. Everything has its place. Everything is cared for. Nature is a cornucopia of need fulfillment. this is the understanding we need as an antidote to the scarcity mindset that fuels human war. When we operate under the belief that resources are limited and we must fight to have enough for ourselves, we create the very scarcity that we fear. Nature operates on a logic of circulation, not accumulation. So when we start, trying to protect and secure and accumulate, we're really, in this hoarding sort of place, which is antithetical to the natural way of things, and will create more scarcity and more war. So there's this cornucopia reality, which is nature's logic. And if you look in a healthy forest, there is no hoarding. A tree does not take all the sunlight. It creates an understory that supports ferns, mosses, and fungi. The forest floor is a cornucopia because nutrients are cycled. The waste of one becomes the fuel of another. This is radical efficiency, not competition. And then there's the enoughness principle. If we stopped competing to win the race, we would find that there is, in fact, more for everyone, and more than enough for everyone. When resources are allowed to circulate, rather than being locked up by the ego's need for security, the system stabilizes. So we have this inner confusion that comes from a fundamental unconscious state of ego separation from nature. And then we are also actually divided within ourselves. Maybe the original war zone is actually within us. In some ways, we're an entire ecosystem of experience with varying degrees of conscious integration. And we are essentially all multiple personalities with conflicting expressions and beliefs. We want peace, but we make war. We want joy and connection, but we make ourselves numb to protect ourselves. We want to acknowledge we want others to acknowledge us and approve of us, but we judge and criticize ourselves and others mercilessly. So there's these, two sides and more than one, like we are a medicine wheel within ourselves, and we are, a whole group of different states of consciousness within each one of us. As I said, a kind of ecosystem. And so there's a way that a lot of what we do here at Earthwalk, works on both levels, the external and this internal, diversity that we carry, and how to learn to, harmonize and connect and work with it all. So nature does not create war in the human sense because it maintains balance through diversity, niches, and symbiotic interconnections that treat boundaries as ongoing negotiations rather than mandates for annihilation. Competitive skirmishes occur, but they are embedded within a larger self-balancing fabric where every species and individual has a place and a purpose. And when we do not honor, cannot see that, do not know that within our own being, we end up in this difficulty that we are finding ourselves in this world. So there's this root of conflict where humans often operate from a deep-seated fear that if we do not dominate, we will be crushed. And this ego-driven desire to win alienates us from the natural world, which works towards harmony and homeostasis, even through periods of loss. So, for us, you know, losing is dying. Nature, trusts in the process and lets go and moves through periods of loss and does not, go to war over that or, see it as death in the same way that the ego does. Again, it's a larger systems experience of, and it might be something that as humans we also can achieve, like we know intellectually that we are one with nature, but that doesn't help us in our individual fears. If we actually had some inner knowing sense, felt sense of security in our integration in all of nature, in our being here, our very existence, to and sort of the image that comes to mind is Mother Nature, who, she's our mother and she wants us, and it's more than a human mother. It's a mother, that has unlimited love and, outpouring abundance, as we talked about before. So if we understood, like deeply in our bones and our cells and our very atoms, how much we were, loved and cared for, and could find a way to trust and accept in the processes of nature, which include life and death, right? And so the ego makes death out of every fault or failure, and yet, nature says, death is just preparation for rebirth. So we kind of intellectually again can see this, understand it, but until we can deeply know it and embody it within ourselves, I think we're, challenged. But there are ways to support ourselves in doing that and to work with our own inner territory and landscapes. So we also have this, conflict between negotiation versus annihilation, where nature manages defenses such as agent, such as pests or invasive species, but it doesn't go into separation from that which is, and then what is being defended. So, it's like what humans do is we, make the other, something to be annihilated rather than negotiating a boundary. So that's how we end up, going to war rather than like understanding this kind of synergistic effect. And in nature, every little step is a different ecosystem and a different expression of, boundary and a kind of, I find often fascinating just so-ness and perfection in how everything is placed in everything's, own personal space in connection with the larger whole. And that is where all of this beauty arises from. And if we could understand ourselves as individuals within that, that's the holarchy and holon understanding of things, and we could deeply embody that emotionally, then, we would learn again how to be more like nature and work our way within, these interactions with the, rest of nature, including other human beings, right, in a way that we can coexist and support each other and create this synergy rather than creating the wars that we tend to do here. So it's a boundary, not a war, and it's a way to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem rather than seeking the destruction of the other. Right? So again, we step into a slightly larger sphere. So what do we need to do in order to follow nature's way? How do we move towards harmony and enoughness? Nature teaches us several practices for navigating the forces within ourselves and our communities. Benevolent surrender. Instead of resisting what is, and these are practices that are useful to try in little ways because as we understand and feel into them and reap the result of them, it seems less crazy and scary, and actually we see, oh, this really works, right? So, in any situation, and I work with it, a lot, I notice where I am in resistance to what is. And then it's in little things like, I'm in resistance to waiting in line because there's people in front of me, right? So I want to go to war with them or with the cashier for being so slow or whatever, so we can, like notice these moments where we are in resistance to what is within us or outside of us. And in that, we practice surrendering to the present moment, not to the good or the bad, the right or the wrong, but just to the what is. And this allows us to accept the discomfort of a situation while remaining open to the flow of the life force. In a defense, we would contract and block that flow, right? And reacting out of fear of what might happen or whatever, like we would go into contraction. And so it's sort of like learning how to breathe through the difficulties, the what is that has discomfort. And most of it is just exactly that. We have discomfort. We feel it in our bodies when we go into defense, when our muscles tighten, when our, breathing intensifies, or, we have sort of a stress reaction or a trauma reaction or something like that. So, well, we don't like that, because it doesn't feel so good. And so this is a process that, again, if we can just allow the discomfort for a little while, and not close the life force off and remove ourselves from it, but stay with it and allow that life force to continue, that will actually move us to the next state. And when we resist, when we, merge, then we get lost in it. So another way is to connect with this heart-centered communication. And so when engaging with others, pause to let your response rise from the chest rather than the intellect. Ground a little bit. Oftentimes when we get activated or triggered, the energy pulls up in us and we go up into the, head and into the intellect and also the defensive posture of kind of fight or flight. And so if we can relax in that moment, sink down, and it's especially useful to focus on the heart, right? Feel into the heart center. It's really the true center of our being, and it has this, vast power within it that, because we block the flow to it, we're not aware of so much. So by maintaining a calm and coherent heart rhythm, we can naturally soothe and regulate our nervous system. And also, as we hold our own space energetically, we are also influencing the others that we're in conflict with. So effectively, we can, help match and refine frequencies. And we can do that, from our own internal space and holding space for ourselves and staying open, and something new, amazing, often miraculous, can happen in that. Another really important, principle to work with is to understand the holarchies versus the hierarchies. Humans can adopt holarchies within holarchies. And it's this form that creates structures that support the individual within the collective. So it's not an either or. And so much of our history, it's been, forced to be, stuck in the collective and like everybody else, or go along with the crowd, or, risk death or whatever, or, we have our own unique individual selves and our freedom and our creativity. And what nature wants is both. It's like we want each unique individual to, be creating within and in harmony with the whole. And so this holarchy approach works much differently and as a more natural system, even though nature also has hierarchies. And you see this in mammals, where the herd has a particular hierarchy. But that's done predominantly, for, again, survival and, this kind of thing. So there's a natural foundation to that that doesn't go into separation, even in that, kind of hierarchical thing. I think in some ways, there's a natural progression, and, like humans in some ways, I think we all come into this world to experience the world from different perspectives. And so it sometimes feels to me when I watch the deer in my yard, kind of keeping the untouchables, I don't know, the ones that are lower on the hierarchy and the totem pole back, feeding first, it's a different system than I think what humans really need. But sometimes that might be, a part of what we have, but I think that there is this, again, greater principle underneath all of this hierarchical thing that we're imbalanced with, again, we're overbalanced on the hierarchical understanding of things. And so then a final, useful practice is granting voice to nature. Oh, let me back up a little bit on this other, on the holarchies versus hierarchies, because there's this thing that, I think is important. It says, we want to understand that this approach in the holarchy allows for cooperation that doesn't subsume free will, right? So the individual's free will is very supported, and it's a kind of assumed that through the natural impulses and the desires of each one of us, that actually will collectively benefit the whole, right? And if we have that mindset, if that's the focus and the intention, instead of, separation or having more, or, hoarding, like, or being dominant, or all of those kinds of things, right? A whole different process happens. And so it's like there's a way that when everyone is a part of an interdependent fabric, then robbing a neighbor is understood to ultimately impoverish the self. And when we know that, within our own being, human beings are naturally loving, naturally giving, naturally wanting to support, and, it's reciprocal, wanting to be supported. But, there's this way that our current culture has really caused a lot of confusion and disharmony around that, because we've been for so long raised in this sort of system of, I don't know, the dominance, the ways of, culture against culture, race against race, humans against nature. So, this is something that's got us into the straight state that we're in. And also a lot of our own internal pain. We would be living in a different place within ourselves if we were also understanding this larger collective potential. So the path to enoughness is recognizing that we are not apex predators who stand above the world, but we are equals in an interdependent fabric. And again, I would say, it's not even recognizing, it's like knowing deeply in terms of sort of a deep inner connectedness, maybe psychically, I don't know, something more than what we know it as now is still, I think, waiting and needing to happen. But that's the principle. And by applying these principles to the small daily disharmonies, like slow traffic or a changed plan, we can train ourselves to trust the flow of nature and move away from the destructive race to the top, or our demand for our way, or needing it to look a certain you know way to us, right, when we can trust that there's something very brilliant even in the way that the ongoing flows of outer life reach us and inform us, and that it is instructive, it is educational for us if we can not just react unconsciously. So I want to shift gears a little bit because I got curious and I thought, well, there's all this data center controversy going on. And it's like within communities, and it's between the communities and the, businesses and the infrastructure kind of plans and that sort of stuff. So maybe the government's, allowing these data centers in, people now catching up with the costs of them. So there's a kind of a little war happening within these communities, and a pushback now against these data centers. So how would nature look at this? What would nature do? So nature manages resources through a principle of radical efficiency. Nothing is wasted, and everything exists within a framework of mutual support. If nature were to design the infrastructure for AI, it would almost certainly reject the model of massive centralized data centers in favor of a distributed, circular, and integrated approach. Here is how nature's wisdom offers a critique and a potential alternative to the current data center frenzy. So first of all, distributed networks versus monoliths. Nature rarely concentrates all power or resource in a single monolith. Instead, it favors networks like mycelial systems or root structures, where resources are shared across a wide area. Your insight that future AI can run on a federated learning and decentralized computer network actually mirrors how ecosystems survive and thrive. I keep seeing this, like there's some way in which, why do we have all of these, things that are just, causing. So I think, I don't know, how it can happen or whatever, but it just seems like, again, it's nature's way, right? And so we're going against, and we need to redesign. A lot of the human problem is our design systems. Even the difficulties I have on the computer are generally around sort of difficulty with the way it's designed. And so if we can look to nature, she's an amazing designer in so many ways. And so maybe there's a way that, we could distribute the load, and, that would also help the system remain more resilient. There's also this idea of reciprocity versus extraction. So in nature, waste is always an input for another process. Trees, fallen leaves nourish the forest floor. So current data centers, by contrast, act as linear extractive engines that consume vast amounts of energy and water while producing heat and hardware waste. Nature would require that these facilities be circular, meaning the heat generated would be used to warm greenhouses or homes, and the hardware would be designed for infinite reusability rather than a 3-year replacement cycle. So another principle is niche integration versus encroachment ecosystems, kind of invasive species, right? So encroachment ecosystems operate by having each participant fill a specific, that doesn't make, ecosystems operate by having each participant fill a specific non-destructive niche. When a species begins to dominate an area at the expense of all others, nature acts to restore balance. Your concepts about data centers being industrial encroachments that degrade the quality of life and environment, are a reflection of this. Nature would likely integrate such technology into the existing landscape in a way that minimizes noise, pollution, and disruption, and ensuring it supports rather than displaces the surrounding life. So we can see how completely, and sort of industrial Western engineering and working with nature has been this way for a while. It's not just in the new data centers in Silicon Valley, but this is like over the top, right? And we've already seen time and again, look at, like me, look at, all of these massive, I mean, I think the first use of the, atomic fission was a bomb, right? So maybe there's good uses and appropriate uses, but we don't go for those. And that's a part of why AI is also, such a dominant, fast pushed concern, because we're in this race and it's mostly a military race. And so once again, we're in this, place of hoarding and war and all of these, problems that humanity has to recognize during this time now and choose a different way. And we can choose it and understand it with our minds, but we have to also be able to embrace it with our hearts. And that's where our fear gets in the way, our fear of each other, our fear of death, of loss, of limitation. So we have to find this way through all of this belief that what we really need is hoarding, defense, all of this stuff, because that's what will kill us. That is what will destroy ourselves along with the rest of nature. So another principle is adaptation over investment, which is also going to catch up with us and probably bite us in the butt here. Nature evolves slowly but decisively. The frenzy of building currently seen is a human construct, a race for dominance. Nature would favor a pause to ensure that whatever is built is sustainable and truly necessary, rather than risking the health of the whole system for short-term inefficient gain. So the push for a moratorium on new data centers is in a sense a call for the system to stop over-consuming and return to a state of balance. The work in advocating for these pauses and promoting decentralization, efficient AI models is a practical application of these natural principles. We have to move away from the dominant, kill or be killed mentality of competing for resources towards a model of enoughness and collective well-being. So then I got curious, what about the current war with Iran? So mostly continuing because of the situation with Israel, who feels existentially threatened, which makes them hyper fearful and hyper aggressive. For them, it feels existential. Yet the means that they are using to protect themselves, this attempt to annihilate the opposition, doesn't add to their safety or anyone else's. This is where the wisdom of nature is so vital. If we look at how nature manages resources, it never seeks annihilation. It seeks its own resilience of the whole system and resilience of each individual within that system. Nature is a web of holons within holons. When you rip out a thread, the fabric weakens. The drive to conquer is a human distortion, a projection of the ego's panic. Ultimately, it is this human separated self we call ego that creates our divergence from nature's great beauty and wisdom. And yet we are her child, and we are an awesome and potentially awe-filled creation ourselves. We know the greater reality intellectually, but our fear-based trauma and survival systems keep us locked inside and separate and apart from each other. So we need to begin to move beyond the mere intellectual understanding of our interconnectivity and interdependence toward a fully embodied experience of being no more important or entitled than anyone else, to affirming the ultimate equality of all beings, including all of nature's systems and individuals. We are fearful that if we don't defend our exceptionalism, we will somehow lose. But the truth is, the more we defend our exceptionalism, the more we will lose. And the truth is, we will win both individually and collectively in ways we cannot even imagine if we let go of our fear-based hoarding, control, systems. So I really believe that it is our destiny, and that this time is moving us through a kind of collective, exposition of these difficulties and problems, for everybody to see. And of course, the suffering that comes with that is real. And so I hope that that will open our collective hearts and, let us begin to realize that there is a different way, that we can find nature's way within us. And there is work to do that, and ways of doing that work. And our science is great, we get it clearly, but our emotions have to follow suit. And there's some way in which we have to feel a part of this living whole as well. And so there's much to be done, but the end result, I do believe, is something that is so beautiful and so wonderful. It's everything that we've been longing for. So we can practice, with all of the little wars within and between ourselves and our small circles of life that directly touch us. And then as we begin to, do this deeper work, which, we do together in community on Zoom a couple of times a month, where we are learning how to, sit with our own inner ecosystems and, like not go to war with inside of ourselves. And it's a beautiful, beautiful practice. And then it's something that you can learn to take with you out into the world. And then we're also going to offer a workshop in nature along Enchanting Run on August 16th from 11 to 3 to explore sort of in vivo these realities in nature, and to seek to exchange our, sort of deepest self-worth that we can really feel and know for this sort of petty self-importance that we tend to want to hold on to. And we will also explore our own feelings and the impact of these times on our lives, and look to nature, as a resource to understand and to help support our own resilience and our own love and connectedness. So we can take a minute even now and just close your eyes and imagine that you're standing by the side of a stream, and you're looking at a section of the creek where the water encounters a big rock. And you want to look closely at the water as it strikes up against this obstacle. It doesn't stop, It doesn't hate the rock. When two forces that are in opposing directions are meeting, in this case, the moving water and the stationary object, the water spins. It creates a vortex. This swirl is energetic, perhaps even chaotic. But watch what happens. The energy dissipates. It releases its force slowly into the hole, slowing down and continuing on its way. I like to think enriched by the encounter, right? It's all of these experiences that water has in its flow, what it meets, how it goes. And water has memory, and we're going to be doing a very interesting series of podcasts on this wonderful element we call water. And we'll do some on the other elements as well, because I think that, they really are quite profound studies and of themselves. So if we reflect on this, in our lives, notice where you might remember holding some kind of opposing energies, conflict, anger, fear, like this, kind of rock, or, this rigid destructive wall, that, and then notice, like, when you run up against those forces in you, do you try to push through them? Do you try to get rid of them? Like this kind of thing. All of this creates that kind of collision that doesn't, isn't as efficient as this natural spiral that will encounter and bend and, surrender to, what is, right? And find its way given the reality of the obstacle. And so here's a question, where in your internal life are you meeting an obstacle with force? Can you allow that friction to become a vortex, a space where you can consciously spin, dissipate the excess energy, and emerge on the other side without trying to destroy the obstacle or yourself in the process? So another example, I think, in nature of, how things, find a kind of balance and cooperation instead of going to war or competition is how plants, work with the light. And so if we walk into, or imagine yourself in an area where, there is a forest, lots of plant growth, and noticing how, in some ways there are many beings competing for the same patch of sunlight. I've even seen pictures online that, with certain species, you can see how the trees grow right up to the leaves and the branches of each other, but they always leave the space. Now, in my forest, there's definitely overlap, but that overlap is moved throughout the day, right? As the sun travels over the sky, or the breeze blows the branches and the leaves, and so light is always coming down to the forest floor in in all kinds of places. And so there's different tiers of canopy in the forest. And so, nothing is trying to block out and take all the light just for itself, right? So observe how the plants reach for the light. They're actively pursuing their needs. They're reaching for it. They are not passive. One may lean slightly to the left, another stretches a branch outward. They are competing for territory and energy. Yet they do so without malice. Neither seeks to enslave the other or render it extinct. They share the space, adapting their growth to the presence of the other. The forest is not smaller because they both exist. It is, in fact, denser, more complex, and more alive, more rich. So the lesson here, competition in nature is often just active participation in one's own survival. It's not about taking away from another, but fulfilling one's own potential in relation to the whole. And sort of trusting that if, like when we're ready, we will receive, right? That that there's this, task before us, which is to fulfill our own potential in relationship to the whole. And so it's not about, robbing from Peter, to get our own. It's not about making sure that we have the best deal, on the oil prices or whatever the heck it is. It's like this, all of this sort of is a kind of hoarding, is a kind of, block in the natural flow of nature's resources in life. And it also prevents us from, fulfilling our own potential. So, the very direction we're pursuing now is sort of off the cliff. We're going over the cliff. But that also may be what we need to do to find our way into something totally and radically different, and to truly humble ourselves, because somehow we think we're the apex, species, most brilliant, most, we're the heavy duty predator, and it's kind of a huge distortion, and it's not our main task, right? What we came here to do is to serve this whole, this beauty with our love. And there is a way that each of us has, built within us to do that. And it is uncovering that is going to give you your deepest joy and fulfillment. And it will, allow you to fulfill your own potential in that relationship to the whole. So notice in your life, do you feel you need to diminish someone else's light to shine your own? How might you grow toward your light in a way that respects the space of those around you, knowing that your individual growth actually contributes to the health of the entire ecosystem? So we don't make ourselves less than, but we don't make ourselves more than. We're truly equal. So now bring that to your own heart. Where in your life are you meeting an obstacle with force? Where are you fighting? Can you allow that friction to become a vortex, a space where you can consciously spin, dissipate the excess energy, and emerge on the other side? Nature manages boundaries and negotiations without needing to annihilate the other. The system is interconnected. Let your rigid, separate identity soften. Feel the pulse of the whole. You are not a thing to itself. You are a part of the web. We know these things intellectually, but we need to know them from within ourselves. We need the feelings of peace, security, and support. We need nature to help us reconnect. She can help us learn to navigate boundaries, negotiations, needs, and balance. She helps us dance with these forces within us. And we have seen that nature creates tension, but not war. Tension is the creative function of life. War is the refusal to exist within the fabric of that friction. We can't stand the friction, so we have to act out, go to war, annihilate the other guy. And so in some ways, this is a way of expanding, our own love, our own union with each other, even though we rub each other the wrong way, right? Even though we are different in fundamental ways. And there's a kind of joy that I have discovered in my own journey, and I acknowledge that, I'm not totally open to every expression, that humans want to offer, and have my own internal reactions and judgments. But the more that I have deepened into this space of nature, and the more in my communities, I see the same beauty that I see in nature, in the human. And I see it in, the human that is awakening in this way into service, into their nature, into their simple selfness that doesn't need to be separate and doesn't need to, like destroy another person to have that sense of selfness. So it's just, the beauty that exists in the human soul and the human spirit is so amazing. And it's so much what we long to do. We long to fall in love with each other. We long to appreciate and enjoy and, kind of revel in somebody else's brilliance as well as my own, and to play off of their brilliance into mine. And, there's all of this incredibly rich beauty in a healthy human ecosystem. And that's what we need to find. So let's continue in our work, and again, I want to invite you to join me on the 16th here at 11 at the Earth Walk Retreat, or join me in some of my workshops online. And we're also having a men's workshop coming up over Equinox that we're going to be doing some interesting connections for, nature, and connecting to, the missing and the soft and hurting parts in the masculine is how I would put it. But it's a men's workshop, and so I'm going to be sort of like holding space. And we also have a wonderful, elder coming as a guy that I know that can help hold that. But anyway, we're kind of gearing up and excited about that. And we're going to be, exploring a little more on our next podcast around this internal work that I feel is so aligned with nature and so much a part of this integration process, rather than going into separation, and so aligned with sort of our huge diverse internal ecosystems within, and helping heal the places where we are at war within ourselves and with ourselves in various ways. Because that really, as we can learn to embrace and balance in our own internal ecosystems, it will help us learn how to be in life and in the fullness of life and in the unknownness of life and in the, depth of our sensitivity in the midst of, whatever, life and death, in the midst of pain and pleasure, in the midst of all of the dualities of the world. That our resilience doesn't come from annihilating death and pain and just hoarding pleasure. It will never work that way, and we can never win at that game. So I hope we can learn to trust, because it's very difficult. We look at the world and we say, oh, we have to build all the AI centers so we don't, end up losing a war to another nation, or, become enslaved by other peoples. And so, it's a huge temptation to support this current system that we have as human beings. But we have to keep looking at the whole history of it, and we have to keep recognizing it again and again, and then looking to nature and seeing a different way. She is our teacher, and I don't know that we have much hope of finding that different way unless we can reach out and work with her and embrace her and honor her in that way, and seek within ourselves then to find how to like bring peace to our own internal wars, bring peace to our aspects of ourselves that want to go to war with our neighbors or our fellow citizens, and also with anybody that we see as other, with anything we see as other, with anything that we go into separation from. There's a different way to understand and allow this beauty that we call nature to thrive and to restore her human children back into balance. So I think we're about at our closing time. So I enjoyed being here. I hope this was of some use to everybody, just to expand the way that we look at things and provide a little different perspective. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Blessings, and may you continue to discover your own journey, your own earth walk, and bring it forth to the absolute fullest, and discover more and more of your inner richness, your depth of ecology in your own being. I look forward to seeing you again